Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the Resilient Leadership Podcast, where everything we talk about is aimed at helping you lead with a greater sense of calm, clarity, and conviction, even in anxious times. My name is Irvine Nugent, and as always, I'm so thrilled to introduce my co-collaborator, Bridgette Tyre. Bridgette, how are you doing today?
Well, thank you for asking, Irvine. Let me see. I'll check in and give you an authentic response rather than a canned one. You know what? I'm doing great. I really am. Today is a day in which I'm just feeling optimistic and grateful to be alive.
Awesome.
How about you?
Yeah, I'm feeling a little stressed. I am getting ready to go on a trip in a few days' time, which will be wonderful, but there's always the loose ends that need tying, and I'm kind of in the midst of that today. But I mean, I can't complain. Everything is wonderful.
Yeah, you've had a lot going on.
Yeah.
You've had a lot to take care of. So I get that stress level. All right. Well, today's topic then is very relevant to that.
Yeah.
And why don't you share with our listeners?
So today we're going to talk about leading through change. And it struck me that I was having some coaching sessions with some clients, and they are going through a lot of change. I work with some government agencies, and we've just had an election, and every 4 years we have a song and dance, and it's a new administration, and it means change. And so there's a lot of energy, maybe more energy around this. I'm not sure, but there is a lot of energy around the change that's about to happen or imagined. And so I said, wouldn't it be great just to think about that? What's happening in change? How do we deal with change? And how do we deal in our organizations that are changing so much? Now, of course, change impacts us personally, but also organizationally. And I just wanted to throw a few interesting statistics, which to put this in a context. And so the Conference Board, which is an organization that does a lot of work around boards of organizations, and they said that 80% of organizations studied reported a collapse in employee morale during times of change. So when there's change, morale drops 80%. The American Management Association reported that 25% of top performers considered leaving within 90 days of a major change being announced.
Whoa.
And then finally, McKinsey Quarterly reported that an individual's normal productivity level during an 8-hour day can drop by 3.6 hours during a major transition. So change impacts us, impacts organizations. And so I thought, let's explore today what's going on when we face change. So Bridgette, I'm curious right off the bat, what have you noticed about yourself when it comes to change?
Man, it's such a great question. I've never been asked that before. So I would say that I'm not somebody who initiates a lot of big change. I've had a lot of change happen to me as a child, and I think I crave stability and security. And so I'm not in the habit of making big changes. I mean, in fact, I've lived in the house I'm in right now for over 30 years. I've lived in the same state my whole life. I've had the same career. Well, not exactly the same career. It has evolved. But as you can see, I'm not a person who, kind of like you, initiates really, really big change. And yet, I think that once change happens, I get on board with it quickly. I'm adaptable. I know how to go with the flow, and I figure out I become resourceful and resilient in the face of change that perhaps I didn't choose. And the only other thing I would say is the only kind of change I think I do initiate is around personal growth and creating new things. I love to create new things, like this podcast, like the books I've co-written. That's a form of change, but it's not the kind of big sweeping change, perhaps, that other people like to initiate.
Yeah.
So thanks for asking. It's such an interesting question. And I think it has the answer to it, at least for me, has some origins in my family system and my life experiences, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
As probably is the case for our listeners, right?
Yep, totally.
Yeah. So I don't know. What about you, Irvine?
It's funny. I do initiate big change. There's a lot of changes in my life. I actually tell a little bit about my life story, and people go, "Oh my God, you've packed so much in. You've done so many different things and changed this and changed that." So
Yeah.
I underappreciate that. I think I enjoy change. I enjoy what's happening next. And I think like you, I can, even if the change is unpleasant, I tend to adapt pretty quickly. I can get on board
Mhm.
with it. Yeah.
Yeah. I see that in you. I think
Mm.
that you are adaptable and resilient as well.
Yeah.
Listeners, I bet they're kind of answering the question for themselves, right?
Mm.
What's your story around change?
Yeah.
Are you
Yeah.
somebody who likes to initiate big change? Do you respond well to change that you didn't choose? What's the story there? But one thing we know is that we don't get to choose whether things will change or not.
Yep.
Yeah,
That's the truth.
they just do. And so it begs the question, is change more pervasive today? I mean, it seems like it, but of course, we've been saying for a while that
Yeah.
change is a constant, blah, 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 right? But there's something seems afoot in the world and in organizations. Do you think
Well, it's funny you said I declined to ask me that question about a month ago. I said, I said, just me, but I just think things are crazy. We're in more change than ever. And it's an interesting question. How do you measure that? But certainly, when you look at some experts and trends, they're saying there are a number of things that are happening, which certainly point to us having to adapt to greater change in our lives. Certainly technological advances, we're in this cusp of AI, and what does that mean? And just think, I was doing a quiz the other day and it was like, when was the iPhone introduced? And I was thinking like, it was back in the 70s. It wasn't. It was like, it's just about 15 years old. It's
really?
really, yeah, it's really a recent thing. And yet look how much has changed since then. There's global interconnectedness, and there's this influx of new information. We had an episode a while ago about overflooding of information,
Yeah.
workforce shifts. Just think of all we've gone through with COVID and now coming back to the workplace building. So all of this means that change really is more pervasive. I think our era is an age of exponential change. And we have concepts. Kind of it can be helpful for us to what's a concept that can describe that. And I think you and me have both talked about VUCA, but
Mhm.
there's another one that I think actually really can get to the core of some of the chaos we're feeling, which is BANI, BANI. So curious, Bridget, what would you like to unpack a little bit of what BANI means?
Yeah. And, I have been teaching VUCA, as you well know, in all of the resilient leadership training that we do. But BANI is VUCA on steroids. And I
Mm.
think what it does is perhaps it helps give some context and understanding to the level of chaos and change that is afoot in the world today, right? So, what does it stand for? So, B stands for brittle. That's an interesting adjective. A is for anxious. Makes sense. N is for nonlinear, and I is for incomprehensible. These are big words.
Mm.
What do they mean? So, brittleness is not just about volatility. That was V in VUCA, volatility. The world has rocketed past merely being volatile or uncertain. Now it's about sudden and unforeseen shocks, or even the destruction of seemingly stable systems, whether they are social systems, economic systems, political systems, technical, environmental, and they can lead to this global ripple effect.
Yeah.
And when something is brittle, it seems solid and strong until it hits a certain stress point and then it breaks.
Boom. Yeah.
So it's not a bend and then break, it's a break. And
Yeah.
there's a shocking quality to that. I see that in the world. And just when I think I can't be shocked, I get shocked again.
Mm. Yeah.
And then A is, of course, for anxiousness, anxiety, which we talk a lot about on this podcast. Anytime you have change, big change, continuous change, anxiety, which is a state of unease in the face of perceived threats, that's just a part of the package. But I think the anxiety is more intense in the world today because we have more misinformation than
Mm.
ever before.
Yeah.
I mean, you think about the advent of AI and deep fakes and, what's true, what's not true. Man, you can't even grapple with the change because you don't know how much of the change is real.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that produces I think a flood of anxiety and a feeling of, at times, passivity, like there's nothing I can do about all this stuff. And then there's nonlinear. It really busts the bubble of the illusion of predictability. That's gone. Nonlinear processes disrupt what we expect to see, right? And it's chaotic, it's disproportionate, it's surprising, and it's counterintuitive. And then there's the incomprehensible nature of change today. The scope, the magnitude, the complexity. Incomprehensible, I think, refers to behavior outside the realm of rational understanding.
Yeah.
We just can't grasp it.
Yeah.
Think of how many events in your own city, your country, your organization that left you scratching your head and saying, what?
Yeah.
Why did that happen? It just, our brain can't quite comprehend it. And I think that this acronym kind of gives us, as I said, a better sense than VUCA did of the chaotic nature of the change that we're experiencing and the turmoil that it can create.
Yeah.
What do you think, Irvin?
Yeah, I love that because, in chaos is uncomfortable to be in because it's hard to derive some meaning from that. I'm just thinking, as we record this, this is a Monday, yesterday, inside 3 days, the Syrian government fell. And there was, you talk about brittle, there was an organization, a regime that we thought would take months and months and months to topple. And it was a matter of days. And then today, we're in the chaos of that. What does that mean? What's the consequences? All of this, and there's chaos around it. And what do we respond? We don't know how to respond, etc. So there's an example in the world stage, but that's happening in our lives as well. And I think how to deal with that and that level of change is something that's really problematic. And I see it in my clients. Do you see it as well in your clients?
Oh, for sure. I'm thinking of a client that I was coaching during the pandemic. During the first year of the pandemic, his wife asked for a divorce after 30 years of marriage, and he was shocked. He did not see it coming. Talk about brittle. It was he thought he had a very strong marriage until it broke. And then concurrently, due to the pandemic, his business went under. And the year before, they had the best year they had ever had financially.
Yeah.
So the two systems that he thought were the most stable and strong, his family system and his work system, poof, like that. And the anxiety of that was something to behold. Now, he's doing fine, but it really was a great deal of turmoil. And so that's a personal example, but I think we could replicate that, couldn't we, Irvin, for lots of folks in lots of different ways.
Yeah.
All right. So if we're dealing with a BANI world, and that's not going away anytime soon, how might we understand what is going on, Irvin, in our organizations as we deal with this change?
Yeah. Well, I think I want to make a distinction between change and transition. I think change is something that's external to us and it's situational. We get a new boss, we get a new role, we get a new job, we get a new technology, there's a new process, a new situation in our organization to deal with. All of that is external to us. And then transition is what we have to go through. Transition is this internal psychological process that is in response to this external change. And I think it's really interesting. There's a model I love, which is called the resistance model of change. And it goes through these stages that we go through in change, even positive change, because no matter negative or positive change, still have an impact upon us. And what happens is, it impacts our morale, how we feel about the situation. And what tends to happen is that there's a decline in our morale as we begin to struggle with adjusting to this new reality. And what's initiated is an inner conflict. That inner conflict we battle as we try to come to terms with that, because we have to let go of something and we have to embrace something. And there's a lot of uncertainty around that. There can be chaos, just as many that can be chaotic. We can search for meaning for it. And sometimes there is no meaning to the change. And so we're in this internal conflict. And that can be unsettling as a stage. And it's only when we move into an exploration then, well, what is happening? Let me explore this a little bit. Is it as bad as I think it is? What stories have I made up? Is there any sense I can make about it? And then gently we become to recovery, either by embracing that change, accepting the change, and kind of that morale is coming up. But one thing, and we dealt with it a while back in an episode about sadness, is that in any change, there's a notion of loss that's happening. We have to give something up. Something is dying in that change. And it may be, if it's a new process we have to learn, we have to give up the knowledge that we had before, or maybe it's something about our identity or a new role or the simplicity. Things have become complex when they used to be so simple, or maybe we have to give up some of our power, our relationships, but something is happening. And I think that can be really helpful for us in the midst of change. What's dying inside of me here? What am I being invited to let go of? And I think eventually then, as we work through that process, and that's not an easy process. And for some of us, it happens quicker. And for others, it's a longer process.
Yeah.
So Bridgette, does that resonate with you as we go through the transitions of our lives?
Oh, totally. I'm glad that you brought back that distinction between transition and change. It echoes, is it Bridges, William Bridges?
Yeah. William Bridges. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's such an important distinction. Change is an external event, but transition is that psychological and emotional process that we have to go through to come to grips with the change. And I think as leaders, it's important to remember that, because just because you initiate change doesn't mean anybody has really transitioned.
Yeah.
It does take some time.
Yeah.
And not to get too frustrated, with that. Also to keep in mind that our brains are wired to be prediction making organs. The brain likes to be able to, as best it can. We're not that great at it, but it likes to predict what's going to happen tomorrow, next week, and so forth. And when we can't do that because a new change is underway and we really don't know how it's going to go and we don't know how it's going to affect us and we haven't figured out how to get there yet, it releases anxiety. And that's just part and parcel of change. And I think that's another thing I really resonate with.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. I was just dealing with, I was working with a client. There was a little self-awareness was happening around a change that they were going through, or at least a resistance, very resistant to this. And it included a new colleague come on board, and just the language they were using. Well, they think that they've got all their together. They're so smart. They're so this. They're so that. And then they suggested we would just change things and change how we would do things. And there was a lot of anger around that. And we kind of stepped back a little bit, and then we dug a little deeper. And really, what we settled upon was that there was a feeling of threat to their status. That, that this new person coming on board with new ways of doing things really was threatening the status and the power that each person felt within the group. And then I think, once they realized that, it didn't make it any easier, but it helped them understand what this reaction was. What was the danger of being lost?
Yes. That is fabulous coaching there, Irvine, because if we can get in touch with what we're losing or what we perceive we're losing, it brings it out of the shadows, right? And we can mourn it more effectively, actually. I love that.
So we've got this internal. So part of that is that ability to internally reflect. But the reality is many of our listeners are also leaders, and they are leading teams. They're leading direct reports who are going through change themselves, or as they're initiating the change. So I'm curious, Bridgette, about any thoughts around that. Like, what does it mean to lead people through change, and kind of what should leaders be aware of?
Well, I want to harken back to that acronym BANI and remind our listeners that we are in an era of dramatic change that is sending shockwaves through most of our systems. So what does that mean? That means that the stages that we go through might be more intense and might take a little longer, right? So as a leader, be mindful of that. And then also think about and be mindful of those stages that you've alluded to. And I'm going to spell them out a little bit more to see if you can use that as a roadmap. Where are people in this process? So that you can guide them through to the next one, but also so that you can be patient to the degree that it makes sense with where people are. So the first stage, right, is denial. And that takes many different flavors, right? Sometimes it's like people just going, you know what? I'm just going to continue business as usual. They pretend the change isn't happening. Or they say, oh, this isn't going to affect me when actually it's going to change everything, right?
Yeah.
Or here's a good one. They're going to have to change. Not me. No, that's wishful thinking. And they've said this before and nothing ever really happens. So there's a little denial going on there. And, denial is actually a very healthy mechanism that kicks in until we're ready to face something.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So that's okay. Denial can be healthy as long as we don't sit in it forever.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then the second stage or cycle is resistance. So that's normal too, that we have some resistance. There can be some anger, some frustration. We might become territorial. You said your client, it was about status, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And this is a desire to keep things the way they were, to preserve the status quo. Again, totally normal. One of the things we've talked about on this podcast is not taking resistance personally, just seeing it, right?
Yeah.
Seeing it as a natural phase. And then that gives way to exploration. So we've moved out of denial. We've moved out of resistance. Now we're kind of maybe perhaps tentatively, but definitely exploring and getting into a place of accepting the new normal, right?
Yeah.
It takes a little bit of time to do that. And then that leads to the final phase, which is commitment, where we actually get behind the change. We've not just accepted it, but we're actually trying to make it happen. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I find that helpful for myself, but also helpful for leaders who, golly, it's so hard to lead people through a BANI world, and let alone to lead ourselves through it. We've got to have some compassion for ourselves. So anyways, those are some thoughts. And Irvine, anything else you want to leave with folks about how they can support their direct reports?
Yeah. So no matter, what stage they're in, I think there are some really helpful leadership behaviors that can help people feel supported no matter where they're at. So, one is active listening. You give some examples there of what it would feel like to be someone in denial or someone in resistance. Are you listening? Are you really listening to what they're saying and really helping that place where they're at? And I think that can really give people the safety to express emotions. And that's the second thing, is validate the feelings. So in other words, so often, I think you mentioned this, we can take it personally. A leader can take resistance personally, like, oh my God, I've done a bad job. People are resistant. This is normal. This is normal behavior. And so to validate that, to validate the fact, hey, it's okay to be resistant. It's okay to feel confused. And in this world, it's okay not to have answers or to have meaning in what's happening. This is all the reality we're all sharing. I statements are really important. Kind of, how is this impacting me? Instead of you saying, kind of what are you going through? Just like, yeah, this is how I'm dealing with this, can be really helpful. Open-ended questions. Can we ask questions that help us be curious and explore? One of the stages as we move through change is exploration. So can we ask questions that perhaps preempt or encourage exploration? And then, share facts gently. Some people are not ready yet. There may be reasons why this change is happening, but can we do it in a way that doesn't provoke, add to the tension, adds to the confrontation, but really, absolutely keep to the facts, keep what is the reality, what do we know, what don't we know, what's a story, what's feeding that story, but be gentle in that rather than kind of forcing people through the door of change. Yeah. Any other thoughts, Bridgette?
Well, those are really good, Irvine. And maybe I would just add two quick other ones, which is to remember that people transition through change at different speeds.
Oh, yeah,
And
totally.
not everybody is going to be in the same space at the same time, darn it.
Yeah.
It's not like everybody moves en masse from denial into resistance. It's just
Yeah.
not quite that easy, and that's okay. And to remember that the key to helping people ultimately, I think, move from resistance into exploration is an acknowledgement and an understanding of what people are losing or
Mhm.
afraid of losing. The
Yeah.
more that we pretend they aren't losing anything, the more they cling to those losses. Yeah.
Mm.
So,
Yeah.
Irvin, what's a way to put into practice some of what we've talked about today?
Yeah, I want to suggest a little practice about beginning to notice what we're focusing on in the midst of the change. There's a quote that I love from a very famous coach, consultant, guru, Marshall Goldsmith. He says, every decision that affects our lives will be made by the person who has the power to make that decision, not the right person or the smartest person or the best person. Once we make peace with this fact, we become more effective in influencing others and making positive difference. So I just love that, So it's, hey, it may not be the perfect person, and you can fret about that. And I think that brings up, where is our focus? Because there are three different areas we can focus upon. One, we can focus upon things that which we have no control. We cannot control this. And the second area is we can focus on things we can control. And the third area is we can focus on things we can influence. Maybe we can't control directly, but we can influence that. And I often find that we spend so much energy in that first one. We worry and we fret about things over which we have no control. And I think we can genuinely surprise ourselves in the amount of things that we can influence and that we can control. I remember doing an exercise a few years ago with a group of managers. We were kind of writing the word, what's wrong about this company? Everything is wrong. The whole list of everything is wrong. And then it was like, what can you do? What do you control or influence? And people were shocked at the amount of things in the day-to-day lived reality that impacts our lives over what we can influence and what we can control. So I would just invite people, this is a crazy world. It's a BANI world. There's a lot of chaos out there. And it is very easy and natural to focus on things over which we've no control. And if we can just spend more time thinking about, what do I control? What do I influence? I think that will give us a sense of agency and a sense that we actually have more control over this chaos than we think.
That's a great thought to end with. I love that because it's empowering, right?
Yeah.
When we get stuck in trying to control things we can't control, we strip ourselves of the power that we have. So it's a powerful reminder. So, Irvin, thank you so much for bringing this timely conversation to us. I love the question that we started with. You asked me, how do I respond or deal with or think about change? And that gave me some really good food for thought. And you brought this new framework of BANI. That was one I hadn't heard about. And I really appreciate you sharing that. And I got a chance to really dive into that. And what it did for me, and I hope for our listeners, is that it contextualizes the scope of chaotic energy in the world.
Mm.
And we're feeling it. We
Yeah.
may not know exactly, we can't always put our finger on it, but it's palpable. It's there.
Totally.
And we have to lead people through this.
Yeah.
We have to lead ourselves through it. And remembering that there are phases that we go through. We can't flip a switch and be on with change. If only it were so easy. If you ever find where that switch is, Irvin, would you let me know? I'll flip it.
I'll let you know.
Okay. So thank you for the fascinating conversation as always. And thanks to our listeners for tuning in. And we look forward to our next conversation.
Okay, everyone. Have a great one. Thank you.
Bye-bye.